Hopefully you had a nice little break there. We're getting ready to kick off our second panel, where we're going to be talking about lessons on really challenging communications of science and society. We're going to have a lot of amazing people and practitioners who really try to bring this to life. You're going to hear a lot of stories and examples in this panel, and we're just going to be continuing to build on all those and stuff that was already talked about in our previous two conversations. We are missing one panelist right now, and we hope that he'll join us shortly. So the panelist that will be joining, I'm going to introduce him in case he's caught up, which is Joe Wirtz. Joe works for our dear Colorado Public Radio, CPR. He's an environment and climate editor there. He joined in 2020 after working as a senior investigative reporter for the Center for Public Integrity. He also worked as a managing editor and senior reporter for State Impact Oklahoma. He also teaches data journalism, and we're hoping that he'll join us here at some point in this panel. You may see his head just pop up. But we do have our other three guests here who they can probably carry on this whole conversation for multiple hours in and of themselves. We have Heidi Stelzer, who is an environmental scientist. She's a speaker, she's a writer. I got to meet Heidi a number of years ago in the early stages of the Institute formation. She was a lead author for the High Mountains chapter of the 2019 IPCC report. She founded Heidi Mountains Cooperative, which is a nonprofit in Cortez, Colorado. So Heidi lives down here in the southwest of Colorado, although I know she's in Denver today. But it's really centered on honoring science and faith and the ways of knowing. She's a professor at Fort Lewis College in Durango, and she's also went back to school to get her master's degree in theological studies. So really leaning into some of the faith communities. Heidi, thanks for being here today. Good to see you. We also have Evan Thornburg, who isn't here in Colorado at all, is actually joining us from Philadelphia. Evan serves as the Health Equity Officer for the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, specifically in the Division of HIV Health. But Evan is a pretty well-known expert here and a great communicator looking at the intersectionality and systems of healthcare and public health, specializing in policy, health equity, the social determinants of health, inclusion of vulnerable populations. Evan is also quite well known because they're quite popular on TikTok, having a pretty popular bioethics TikTok conversation. So really engaging in that social media. And as someone who's not on TikTok, I'm guessing, you know what I mean? I should probably go find some of the videos. Evan, thanks for being here today. Great. Hi, Joe. You joined us. I did a brief introduction for you. We're so glad to have you. How are you doing today?
Great. Sorry, brief Wi-Fi problem, I think, but I think we got it ironed out.
Awesome. No worries. You're here. You sound, you look great. And then our kind of both expert too on this panel and also going to be the guide and for the conversation and keep the conversation moving is Aimee Bernard, Aimee Pugh Bernard. Aimee actually has a ton of titles, so I'm not going to list all of them, but she is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Anschutz. She is the director of the CU Anschutz Basic Sciences Departments and the Science Communication Program. She has a strong outreach and literacy sort of background and interest to really promote science literacy way beyond the walls of academia. And she's got a ton of different projects that she's engaged in, including this awesome podcast. I love to call it People's Podcast, focused on community-based vaccine education and other topics. But her podcast is called Help Make It Make Sense. Aimee, thanks for being here today as well. I'm going to turn this over to you. Help make it make sense for all of our listeners today. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the panel, and I'll see you here at the end of the hour.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having us. And also, it's an honor to be amongst all of these panel members. Everyone has such amazing expertise and knowledge to share with us that I thought we would just dive right in. So I've got a couple of questions, and I'd love for this to be a dynamic conversation. So jump in, ask questions. Let's just have this be kind of a fun conversation amongst us. And, you know, if there's any chat questions too, that would be awesome. So to start us off, to explore the ethical implications of effectively communicating the uncertainties and disagreements inherent in scientific research, how can we convey the nature of scientific uncertainty to the public while balancing the importance of consensus and simultaneously acknowledging the ongoing nature of scientific inquiry. And Joe, as this is kind of your realm in CPR news and media, I thought you could maybe start us off and then we'll all chime in and have a conversation.
Yeah, sure. This is something we think a lot about. We're mostly communicating, at least on my team, climate science and environmental science, and do a fair amount of that, both in reminding people of the case for climate change and what we know. And, some of that is things we've known for a long time. And then some of it is more, cutting edge and new science and new research that's coming out about that. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about this and talking about it. And, being public radio, public media, we are always thinking about, how to keep people informed on these issues. And, we really try to think a lot about communicating the knowns and the unknowns, and trying to meet people where they are and make clear to them in plain language as much as we can what we know, why we know it, what the science is, what the science is saying, and communicate as much as we can the uncertainties and things that we don't know. We try as much as we can to not say that everything is settled all the time when it's not, but make clear when there is a major consensus on things. In our realm, there's very little disagreement. I would say none that I know of, about, say, things like CO2 emissions. So there's widespread, nearly unanimous agreement among top scientists in the field that this has been increasing dramatically since post-industrial times, and we try to communicate that clearly. That's sort of baseline science for a lot of our reporting. But some of the new stuff that's coming out in some other areas of climate change and science are very much more of a live issue, and we try as much as we can to explain the unknowns. This goes as far when we're looking at stuff to just talk about the confidence scientists have and stuff, and where applicable, show where the scientific debate lines are on things. And there certainly is it's a very much a live, dynamic topic, and a lot for people to know. So, our order, first order of business always with us is trying to explain very clearly the knowns and the unknowns.
Yeah, one thing I'm going to add to that. So as a scientist and someone who communicates science a lot, questions I will often get from people who are not scientists that I'm talking to, mostly in the realm of vaccine advocacy, is a lot of what I do as an immunologist. But sometimes people will say, well, when you talk about things, you're not definitive. Like, I will not typically don't use the word, well, we always think this, or we never think this, because we know that science is, in the scientific method, is driven by discovery. And we know that science can change its mind, or we can change what we think about science based on new information that comes our way. So that's something that I think, someone who's not a scientist was like, well, sometimes you're not definitive enough. But then there's other times that we saw in the earlier panel where we might get in trouble for saying, oh, the vaccine's going to save us, or the vaccine's the silver bullet, or whatever, which I personally never said that.
Yeah.
But it's a good idea. You should get vaccinated. It's a good idea. It's, it's going to increase the health and safety of our communities. But it's just interesting because it's double-sided, right? If we say always or never, we get in trouble. If we don't say those things, so does anybody else want to chime in on that? Because I feel like that I want to communicate the disagreements and the continual discovery of science, but it's challenging to do that. Evan, what about you? I know that I watch all your TikToks. I mean, I am like probably the biggest fan. I know you got to chime in here.
I think it's too big. First of all, as an ethicist and a consequentialist, I like to try to pull people away from certainties. And I find that what makes it easier to communicate science's being uncertain and prone to change is, first of all, addressing the fact that we live in a society that loves dichotomy. Good, bad, big, small, up, down, right, wrong. And it's just like, that's just, the world doesn't exist like that. A lot of things are neutral.
Yeah.
A lot of things are subject to change. And when you point out how much people want dichotomy, it makes people work on that. And then that from there, it's easier to explain science. And then the other thing I like to use is like simpler examples, right? Like, I think like one of the analogies I saw was how the evolution of cars, right? Car safety has gone, right? When my parents were riding in cars, you could put a child in the front seat, no belt. And we learned pretty quickly that was not a good idea to let your 1-year-old crawl around like that. And over time, since the invention of cars, which is going into its 100th year soon, you've added things like airbags. You've added side airbags. You added passenger airbags. You've added seat belts. You've added, and then that's just what's in the construction of the car. But then we've added things like speed limits, right? And ways to track what speed people are going, like speed tracking, external in society to manage, because all of these are safety features. There's no one of these items that, like, again, is like the silver bullet that you will stay alive in a car.
Yeah.
It's the combination they're in, and they're subject to change. Like, first airbags were just in the steering wheel. Well, what we've learned about steering wheel airbags is that depending on what the material is of the steering wheel, they can shatter and blind you. That's not good. What we've found is that things like drop-down airbags or driver knee airbags, right? That it's not just enough to go face first into a steering wheel and be safe, but actually the way that a car can be hit can crush the knees. So, and that matters.
Right.
None of those is, so nobody would ever say, oh, I don't like cars aren't useful anymore because we added a knee airbag or that we've like shifted the speed with which you should drive. Like that, people would find that absurd. I think that's a better address.
Yeah, and it's a good example of, I think, following maybe updates. I guess that it's scientific, but following updates in safety to make the car or the vehicle a little bit more safe. The more we learn about certain things, like, yes, the airbag in the steering wheel, maybe not the best absolute thing alone. Yeah, agree. Yeah, that's a good example because most everyone here would be familiar with cars. Very universal. Heidi, how does this like inherent like uncertainties and disagreements in your realm, what would you like to?
I think that uncertainty is why many of us are scientists. We're fascinated with interactions with others, with our planet, with the universe, the cosmos. And I think sometimes we do a good job of conveying that fascination through programs that get developed. We can think of, Carl Sagan's The Cosmos. The fascination is featured really well. That's a very popularized, familiar way of featuring it. But the experience of doing science, it's nothing like what you did in middle school or high school. It is nothing like anything that is almost ever soundbitey enough to end up in the media, in a news report. And so where and how we can create those experiences as educators in our world. And that's what I do in my classes at Fort Lewis, is I'm like, what's science really like? And like, what science is really like is that we don't often have more than an N of 1, and an N is our sample size. And so we do sample size of 1 in some of my classes so that we can have that conversation of what's it like if we pull off something only once and once ever, and what can we learn from that, and what do we build in by being able to see the replication, the repetition that can happen in science too. And I can't help but want to speak to, where does more certainty come from? So I'm telling folks, certainty doesn't come from science. My best thought on where certainty comes from is one another. And this is very fitting for this day of discussion about ethics and values. It comes from values like mutuality, like reciprocity, care, connection, love. Those are all values that we can bring in. And where and how have I seen that carried out the most? It's in people who often have lived with the greatest risk, have been the least well served by society, being the ones who are often willing to give the most of what they have and to want to build a culture of reciprocity. Because when we don't have a culture of reciprocity, they're the ones without enough water. They're the ones without that are going in for work because they're the essential workers during a pandemic, right? So a lot of folks at risk, and where and how can we build that culture so that the certainty is one another and not necessarily what we've been hoping science could do.
Yeah.
But it's just a tool. It's a problem-solving tool and a place of awe and wonder.
I agree. That kind of what you were saying reminds me of, so I do a lot of vaccine advocacy and education as an immunologist and science communicator, but people will often ask me, well, why do you get vaccinated? And I said, well, first off, I would like to protect myself and also my family, but I see us as an interconnected community. When I go to the grocery store or an athletic event or the academic campus where I teach, I want to take care of everyone that I see, and I don't want to be an individual who would spread illness or something that could harm someone else. I don't want to be responsible for that. So from my perspective, getting vaccinated is one way that I protect myself and my family, but I also I will protect all of the community members. So I like to see us or think of us as an interconnected community of humans who are caring for one another and doing all that we can to protect us and just take care of our communities.
I don't have any other emojis. I'm going to do the actual physical emojis during this.
Yeah, Ring Central, we need a heart.
The thing I also want to add in is that when communicating science, we have to learn to communicate it through the culture and language that people come from. And I think that's what I also find very fascinating is that the way that, like using the example of vaccination, there's a way that I spoke to my mother, who is a 69-year-old woman, Black woman from the South, who remembers things like the Tuskegee experiment. There's a way that I talked to her about getting vaccinated versus the way that I talked to my 13-year-old godson, who doesn't have the same foundation and is from Philadelphia and has, he's a teenager. And so his aloofness comes from being young, not from this history that was very jarring that he has yet to learn from us because we haven't yet given that to him. And then I think about like the way that some of my friends spoke to their family members who are Spanish speaking and come from various areas in the diaspora, right? So I also want to make that note that when you're trying to explain the uncertainty of science, it has to be relational to something that has this level of importance and to some extent like deification in people's backgrounds too.
Yeah, like finding common ground and things that you can connect with others on, things that are like the health of your families and community and hopefully saving the planet and things like that. No, absolutely. So Heidi, I'm going to shift a little bit, but it's related to what we were just discussing. Because this is, and everyone chime in, but I'm going to ask Heidi to start us off. To examine the strategies for respecting and incorporating traditional knowledge systems into scientific discourse, how can we as scientists and communicators promote the co-creation of solutions that address critical issues facing rural and indigenous communities, things like environmental sustainability and public health?
Thanks, Aimee, for asking that question. I think to start is to recognize there is immense, huge, giant amount of understanding of land, of water, of people, and of the cosmos, of the universe, in Indigenous and rural communities. And oftentimes, as somebody who chose 15 years ago to move to and live in a rural region, so I live in Southwest Colorado, in the town of Durango, and I've been there for 15 years. And I grew up rural too. To be honest, I grew up outside of Boston in a suburb. That oftentimes I hear in the spaces I've gotten to navigate in, people say, if only they knew. Related to vaccines, but certainly related to climate change. And I think Evan's point is really important. It may be the language that we're using that suggests people don't know because they're not willing to use phrases that have been politicized. So when we see something like the phrase climate change get politicized, we can almost say that's not going to be the language someone uses. But in the new 5th National Climate Assessment that just came out, they speak to that rural communities face unique challenges and opportunities, that they are the traditional stewards of the nation's lands and waters. And I would offer they're doing science in that work with that sample size of 1. And each time that they face earlier snowmelt, a hotter summer, less water, snow when they don't expect snow, any number of changes in the climate and the weather systems that impact the livelihoods of these families that live in rural regions. And then I want to speak to the justice piece for tribes, because tribes are on land that they are stuck with, and they're stuck with because of a system of colonization and people taking over lands. And that creates an even more unique set of challenges for a tribe. When the climate weather they're inheriting at this point is completely inconsistent with who they are, how they've lived, and it creates a justice. So people are experimenting. And that's what I see in rural Colorado is everybody's making choices. And then what's my formal system of science communication with other scientists? It's peer-reviewed, published papers. In communities, it's go talk to your neighbors, hang out and have a cup of coffee at the diner. People are talking science all the time in rural America. We just don't even call it science most of the time because it's just where and how you make decisions and you make choices. And so, yeah, I think a piece of it is the equity piece. And a piece of it is broadening our understanding of what science is. It's not just what happens at universities and institutions. It's what we all do. It's kind of human to science.
I completely agree with you. I founded and I run a community outreach science program for elementary school students around the Aurora campus. So just in Aurora, offer it for free because there's not a lot of money in that area for the kiddos that we go to. But one of the things that I tell them, the elementary school students that will participate in this program, is that everyone here is a scientist. Mm-hmm. Has anyone ever cooked? Well, you're a chemist. Has anyone ever played with water or, things like that? Then, physicist or, there's just different ways of thinking about science. And, science is all around us. Everyone uses science and does science every single day. I think in the context that we're talking about science communication, we want people to know, we want to elevate what they know about science to make the best decisions or informed decisions as possible. But Heidi, you're absolutely right that science is all around us and that every single person, is a scientist. Joe, are you going to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what you both said in the realm of bringing it is real and tangible for folks is really, really important. I think when a lot of regular folks, science has this ethereal, like mystical quality to it, to a lot of people. It seems like magic, and they don't really understand. A bunch of really smart people just, go into some lab with whizzing machines and lights, and then they come out with some answer, and maybe the answer means something, that means a change in people's lives. And it seems, it seems it seems mysterious, like these are wizards telling us how things are. And I think as much as possible, like you all just pointed to, bringing that as real as possible, and as much as we can, we try to explain that, how we know what we know. How do we know CO2 levels are up? Well, there's a sensor that measures it. They scoop up the air into a flask and then and measure it. And then, what did they do before they had the sensor? Well, there's little bubbles of that air that are trapped in ice, and we could extract those little bubbles and analyze them the same way. And so it helps people understand what seems potentially magical is how do we know what carbon levels were in the atmosphere 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Things like that. And it helps to be able to put things in as much of a tangible form. And a lot of times there is a lot of science that's very wild and complicated, but a lot of it, I think, can be broken down in pretty simple terms. A lot of times it's just scientists out there counting things or measuring things or recording things and finding an entry point for people. I think, that's tangible, that can demystify this as much as possible, helps them trust the process more than a bunch of lab wizards coming to a conclusion and writing a fancy paper in a journal they've never heard of.
Agree. I would like to go off of that. And there is a comment that I think is at the heart of what I try to do, and I'm sure all of us try to do when we communicate science, is to not use all of the jargon. I mean, we can all talk in jargon all day long to each other, but that's not going to help when you're talking to people who are not scientists. And I'm sure, Heidi, with you in those rural communities, when I talk to people who aren't scientists, even here, in the city, there are a lot of, I try to simplify and use words that are understandable. And when I say simplify, I'm not saying that because I don't think other people, I think everyone is capable of being a scientist. Mm-hmm. I don't think it takes incredibly, brilliant, unusual people. I think anyone can be a scientist. And that's what I'm trying to convince all of these elementary school kids to become scientists. But I think what we need to do is just communicate in, ways that are understandable. Like as an example, when I go and talk to someone about like my taxes, or like I talk to someone who's fixing my car, if they use jargon, I'm like, can you explain that in a way that I can understand it? So I try to do the same thing. Evan, I want to pick your brain here because I know that it is large. In the realm of public health and health equity, how would you go about kind of the promotion of these like co-creating solutions within communities that you serve?
I mean, the thought that I have immediately, and I'm glad somebody put it in the chat, is one of the things I love about public health, and I'll probably never give it up, is the fact that it is the place where science and humanities and social science conversations meet a lot. We have to be thinking about biostatistical elements, and we have to be thinking about virus tracking, but we also have to think about how do people experience how we talk about there being a virus that's loose. And as someone who does equity work, it's super important to start to think critically around when we talk about the medical humanities, thinking about how we can include in some of the ways that communities have done this sort of tracking. And my favorite example is the hantavirus story in public health, which involves the fact that science couldn't solve that. It was an indigenous communities mythos and religious storytelling that unlocked the key to being able to discover the hantavirus. It was these things in tandem of talking to a group of elders about their oral history. I think about in reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and I had never thought about this before, was the idea of how do we incorporate visions and dreams, especially if those things are aligning across a community and that has some indication, right? Because indicators don't have to start. I think that's the thing is science, going back to Joe's point of like, it's somebody in a lab with like these liquids in vials and Bunsen burners, but science starts in a humanity space, right? All of these people in my neighborhood are sick. Why? All of these people in my neighborhood or all these people in my community struggle with heart disease. Why? None of us have access to healthy foods and our teeth are falling out. Are those correlative? Having a humanities conversation first, and that's the most relational, right? Because going back to Heidi's point too, like people are sitting around at the diner being like, my horses are sick, or your horse is sick, my horses are sick, and they're like, and then they figure out that there's one stream that runs across all their properties that the horses have been drinking from. Science needs, I think we've done a disservice by applying the elitism that I think was first established in like academic spaces to sort of give people a grasp of like how important science was, but it's spun off into, I think, sort of a strange place where it, in a lot of ways, a lot of people feel themselves separate from community, and like science starts where the question starts, and the question starts with everybody, you know?
Yeah, I like that. I wanted to acknowledge there was a comment in the chat that I really liked that said, understanding that indigenous knowledge already covers an understanding of a lot of the phenomena that scientists are presenting. And that there's a lot of things that were already known that Western science, comes about at asking about, explaining later on. So many things more than we could probably, but just worth mentioning, like building pyramids. A lot of medicinal knowledge of plants and things like that. There's just so much information.
Fire.
Yeah, we aren't the first to, Western science is not the first to figure it out. Maybe they wrote it down somewhere or communicated it to larger audiences, but absolutely, I agree with that comment. So I just wanted to acknowledge that content or that comment. So thank you. Evan, I'm going to kick this one to you first. In the context of like science being like, the truth, to explore the ethical implications of positioning science as the only method to obtain truth and knowledge, how can we foster a more nuanced and balanced understanding of the role of science in human society that acknowledges limitations and contributions?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think happens for a lot of people, this gets into like my love of looking into scientism, because so many people love sci-fi. Because so people love science, but they also love science in a way that like science doesn't operate like that. And I think this leads people into spinning off into things like conspiracy theories, and especially falling prey to things like disinformation. I just watched this like mini series about a woman who ran a cult, and the cult was like really big on colloidal silver, which that every day with that I fight it. But this idea that science can do all things, or that there's sort of an assumption for people who don't live in science spaces that science has already done all the things, they just haven't told us, right? And so it's where you get this idea that like someone can be injected with like nanometers and be tracked by the government, and it's just like a connective thought of like, nanometers exist, people get injected with things, and there's a government that wants to track us. And I'm not saying each of those individual pieces are wrong. Oftentimes the individual pieces are right, but they don't tie together. They don't meet each other. They're just like, that's not how those things connect, or they don't connect at all, at least not currently. And I think helping people understand that not all things in science are tied to each other or can utilize one another. There is nowhere in public health that I can use proton therapy. So I cannot inject you with protons when I encourage you to get vaccinated, because I don't have any of those skills to utilize proton therapy. I think that's breaking those bonds, because people, when they hear that something is science, that's that's it. It connects to all science, and that all scientists know and understand all science is also super important and happens a lot. So it's why people can be duped by disinformation related to science and health sciences, especially. Your podiatrist knows nothing about your eyes, and I really don't want your foot doctor touching your eyes. Like that's one of the jokes that I like give to people, and they're because I'm like, do you want somebody who's touched your feet to then touch your eyes or tell you about them? And they're like, no. And I'm like, exactly. And that's not saying that they're not a wonderful podiatrist, but don't let them near your eyes. They may know the basics, I don't know, but I think when you give these, sometimes giving absurdist examples or funny examples, I like to use humor a lot sometimes when I'm teaching in classes and what have you, about how like science just can't do that. Like I love the Jetsons, I do, but if you get that reference, but they just can't do that. And I want it to, but maybe depending on what it is, but it has limits, and for these reasons.
That's kind of a double-edged sword to me in a sense. Like, I love the idea that people think science can do a lot of things. But we also need for people to understand that it cannot do all of the things, and it doesn't tie together all of the pieces, like you were mentioning earlier. Like there's some things that just are impossible with science. Now it's cool to think that people might think that, but at the same time, it's just that's not how science works. I wanted to bring back a quote from the panel that was earlier. Fabian Medvecki, who wrote a book, I think, called The Ethics of Science Communication or something very similar. But one thing that he mentioned in the earlier panel is that science is not good or bad. It is a way of knowing, which I think is really important. So Heidi or Joe, do either of you want to kind of chime in on that bit?
I would love to. It's how I landed in theology school after 30 years of being a scientist, is that science is one way of knowing, but also we're using the word science and we're using some description of what it looks like to see and measure. That's one way of sciencing. Science is bigger, broader, and more wonderful than is often the way I like to talk about it, than Euro-Western science and what is the predominant mode of science in the world, sort of the prevailing. There are so many more ways of sciencing that were characteristic of European science in the Middle Ages. And that's part of how I landed in theology school, is that there's folks who know about that history and know where and why science in Europe lost some of the traditions of being a scientist and how we science. The indigenous cultures didn't lose. And so that's sometimes why we see these different adjectives being put in front of the word science to try and say, well, what else can be part of scientific knowing? Intuition is a part of scientific knowing. Contemplation, reflection is a part of scientific knowing. And faith can be a part of scientific knowing. And that I want to be a little provocative because we've got a reception tonight, and I hope that I'm here in Denver, and I hope that the reception's fun. So I just ventured into that science and religion space, and I hope that we can have that be in person, because I also think that some of these conversations, as we've been talking about the ethics of science communication, I have found it matters so much to plant seeds, but water them in person, in community. There are certain patterns of conversation that don't do well over social media or via Zoom and panels. This is the opportunity for a bigger conversation. I'm sure that's what Kristen and then the Institute of Science and Policy see that can come from today. So with those other ways of knowing, I have touched plants and known they were alive and not dead. And just by touching them, by holding them in my hand, and that's not without any training in the sciences, that's with lots of training, and that's with experiencing physical contact with a lot of plants. And then where and what would be a Euro-Western or empiricist rational approach would be to then physically measure or regrow the plant. So in some ways we can demonstrate. But that moment of touching moss under the Greenland ice sheet that had been buried for 500, 1,000 years, I knew it was alive because I could feel, like, from its texture, that it wasn't in Monty Python, not dead yet, sort of space. So I hope that we can start to broaden in our society, and that this conversation today can be a way we can talk about the many ways of knowing, science being bigger than we've often thought of it or been trained of what it is.
I would also like to expand that to, we talked about rural and indigenous communities. You've talked about faith communities. As a scientist and immunologist and someone who does not shy away from testifying and for pro-science legislation, I think we need to expand and talk to everyone who is willing to talk to scientists about science, people who are open-minded and want to have conversations, because I have a lot of science friends who are like, oh, I've never talked to that person. They're not gonna, that's a no-go. And while that may be true with some individuals out there, I feel like it's our job, or at least I feel it is my duty as a scientist to try to answer questions and go out to the community and talk to people. And without making this, political, there's differences in how people view vaccines and certain health-related issues in this country based on, politics. And I think that I welcome talking to people who are open-minded. I would hope that they would like to have conversations with scientists as well. I just feel like we need to do a better job at kind of opening ourselves up to communicating and sharing, what we know, and being open to listening to concerns. I think that is something that we need to do a little bit. We need to do more of that. I know that Joe works on that every day with media outreach. So I think
like
that's
you. We'll talk to there's very few people that we don't want to talk to about this stuff, and won't try to meet them where they are. And anybody for the most part. I can think of some real outlier scenarios, but for the most part, I'm with you on that.
There's just a comment I saw. It says that listening is a good communication skill, and I completely agree. I'm going to give you guys a story, since that is one of the things we are doing here, lessons on challenging communication. So I am a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo. The owner and founder of our studio, who I love like family. I've been part of that studio for 10 years. And he's an elderly individual. He is Black. He is amazing, brilliant, retired chiropractor. And vaccines were not a thing that were trusted. And I've been part of that studio now for 10 years. I started 10 years ago with my kids. I have twins. They're also have moved up in the ranks. And this is a studio, this family is part of my family. I love them and respect them. And I also respect that, being a chiropractor, there are different kind of belief systems and things like that. And we've had conversations over time, very respectful. And when COVID hit, I gave a couple of vaccine talks about COVID and upcoming vaccines and things like that. And he got vaccinated. And I was just, I just can't even express to you how happy that made me, that there was trust built between us, for years. And that's the kind of thing that I think science communication is about, building trust and talking to people. And I know that it takes a long time, but, I used to run marathons and half marathons. So I am not afraid of long distance and working hard. And so that to me, I thought was something that it's important for us to kind of engage in the long game and to be open and listen. Because certainly I don't think that would have come about if we didn't have this kind of ongoing conversation about things like that. So you know, and I just feel like that's something that we need to do maybe more of.
Yeah, I really appreciate that story. And I would add to it offering maybe a big part of science communication is trusting everyone who isn't in the scientist professional world, whose vocation is not science. So we've said everyone's a scientist. If we can trust in those spaces and ask questions and then listen, and that somehow science became a space of doing a lot of telling, and yet if we trust others and we trust their inner teacher. I'm going to use the language from Parker Palmer, and Hidden Wholeness is the book that's coming to mind. And knowing Nicole, she can probably pop it in the chat. But in circles of trust, we aim to build a relationship in which, if we ask questions lovingly, kindly, with an interest of helping the human who's struggling with something, struggling to decide whether they should get a vaccine or not, struggling to decide how many cows should be on the land, struggling to decide if they should give up the agriculture that they've been doing for generations, right? Where and how can we create a space where scientists are available to ask questions and help guide people? Maybe we're guides more than anything else. And that's definitely the way I've seen myself as an educator in the space of a college setting. I'm a guide more than a teller of information.
I like this is why I like social media. And I feel sometimes like I have this like internalized battle because like part of the research that I did for my master's was basically talking about all the ills of social media. But I'm accidentally a creator because I am part of asking the question of like, how does social media affect our health? I also was like, do people want to know these things? And so maybe if I just like post these things alongside of my own learning. And so that's what I did. Like that's how I started on social media, was posting these things I was learning in relationship to my thesis. And what I've learned in building a following is that people do want to know, they do want to better understand science. They want to better understand philosophy and ethics. They want to make better decisions. They want to let go of Puritanism and dichotomous thought. They want to not think of things in these very rigid good bad that really hurts our ability to understand science and makes us hyper political or hyper partisan. But they don't know how, because it's an exercise and it's training and it's education and it's information. And I think being a science communicator on social media is so unique because although, yes, I can post like, a 1 to 10 minute video uninterrupted in my thoughts for people to consume in sort of the same way that we do asynchronous classes, I also can like interact in the chat. I can talk to people. People can message me, DM me, and I can correct things for them or realign them. I can make a video responding to a comment that they've left. People can stitch me and then I can respond back in that way too. I can structure and also protect my community of people who follow me by siloing, using things like the block button so I can keep out people who are going to be aggressive and cruel. And people can ask their questions around these things. And I think also upon building an audience and becoming of a certain size as a creator, what that also does is it gives people a little bit of hope too. Like when I've done videos about the science of like trans identity, for example, that does something for folks who are living in a scenario where they are feeling very singular in their trans identity. And then there's a person with 140,000 followers who are saying, no, this is a real thing. Here's the science to it. And also anybody who wants to negate it doesn't understand the science, and that's okay. We can address that too, or we can fix that, or, or we won't tolerate abuse and cruelty. Social media has a really strange way of doing all of that. So that's why I like it as a tool for science communication, but it does take such a fascinating talent and skill around storytelling and interaction and interactivity and being engaged with your audience no matter how many times you have to answer the same question in the comments repeatedly or whatever. But it makes me think of all of what you're saying, Heidi, and what you all have been saying about this. Because I'm usually not like ashamed, but I'm usually like reticent about my social media. Just because a lot of people don't, in the communities that I'm in, the professional communities I'm in, they don't see the value. They're like, what's that? I don't get it, and I'm like, it just makes me feel young or juvenile. And so it's really hard to know when to be like, oh yeah, I'm on this platform and I do it in this way, because of we still are looking at these like tools, these communication and media tools, with this perspective of sort of like, oh, you post on like, Instagram, or I don't know. It's intriguing. The experience of it is intriguing, but it's a fascinating tool for what you speak of.
Chiming in on that, I think that I agree with you. There are like I also have a TikTok channel. Compared to Evan, we will not say that I am not successful. However, one of the reasons why I think, doing that is it helps you're communicating to an audience. Number one, there's a lot of young people on TikTok, which is, I think, it's the next generation. So I think it's important to be on some of these platforms. I know a lot of scientists will be like, oh, I don't waste my time with that. I don't see it as a waste of time. It is a way to kind of hone your skills as far as communicating in kind of a more simplistic, engaging way, maybe stories, things like that. Because one of the things I wanted us to talk about was strategies that we all use to bridge the gap between the scientific community and the public that would foster understanding and trust. And I think utilizing like social media platforms and clearly communicating, simplifying messages, removing jargon and barriers to understanding, I think is really important. Knowing your audience, like on TikTok, you have to be engaging. If you're not, just people keep scrolling. So that's kind of hard for me, but using metaphors and analogies, things like that. So would you all please share some of the strategies that you have to bridge the gap between science and like the public?
I mean, the big thing for us is knowing who that audience is, right? Colorado Public Radio is obviously radio, and we do a lot of audio, but we do digital stories and newsletters, and all those audiences are very different. So we think a lot about who those audiences are, and what who they are, where they are, and how to make sure we're getting accurate information communicated in the right way to the right people. So we think a lot about so knowing who those audiences are as best you can. And I think again, our best success has been trying to be very clear and hopefully knowing those audiences well, but be clear about what we know and what we don't know, and try to build that trust, brick by brick by being clear and concise about the knowns and unknowns with a mind on who that audience is, and and where they're from, and where they're coming from.
I'm going to go for being provocative again here, and tell a story about, I was in Germany this summer, and we were on our way from Frankfurt to the city of Weimar. And I wanted a break. I wanted to stop, something that we could do. This is my two sons and my husband and I. And I was like, wait a sec, we're in castle country. There are castles here. So you can go onto Google and say castles near me. I know you can do that for like peaks and mountains and glaciers, but like castles was a new one to Google. And we ended up at the Wartburg Castle, which is where Martin Luther, the reformist of the Catholic Church that led to the wave of Protestantism, hid out when his life was one of the times when his life was wildly at risk because of the ideas that he was choosing to put forward. And there in the bookshop is a book called Brand Luther. So Evan, Brand Luther is the story of all the platforms that Martin Luther was willing to use. So when we want radical transformation of society, and we can argue that the Reformation is one of those big ones, and say maybe there's some lessons to learn from that for what we want to see for equity and justice now in our world. Pamphlets, booklets, books, talks, sermons. If social media had been available to Martin Luther, I bet you that Martin Luther would have himself been in social media. I hope I'm not being too sacrilegious in offering that. But for me, what's been the most helpful to the question that Aimee's asking is to be willing to step into all these spaces as openly as I can, so that I can be transformed by the spaces that I'm in. If that makes sense, I think it's what I know I have control over is my own personal transformation. And then to hope that personal transformation, by being willing to have science conversations at a chili cook-off in a rural community, is and where and how is that going to change me in some way that it brings about a greater level of transformative change in society and trust in science by being somebody folks know. And I highlight all that. I want to beckon to one of the points of the National Climate Assessment that just came out, the 5th National Climate Assessment. It says that transformative adaptation has to happen. And yet we rarely talk about transformation. What does it really look like for transformational change to take place? And recently in one interview I did, I said, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And we'll know we're there when we all get really wildly, crazily uncomfortable. And we're not, right? Which is also what happened during the Reformation. A lot of people got really uncomfortable. It's not going to happen if we can keep tucking ourselves in to activities, spaces, ways of living, ways of doing, ways of engaging, ways of being that are the norm. We're talking about a big change that's needed.
Yeah, I agree. I would say that one thing with these social media platforms that it's called homophily. It's the bubble of, like, if you like a cat video, you keep getting more cat videos. And if you like, something that is, about like cooking or whatever, then you get more of those and less of other things. So that is one of the, I agree, we need to use all of this, and that change is uncomfortable, but change is necessary. And the only constant is change, right? We need to be, I try to be aware of making sure I'm not keeping myself in that bubble as much as I can. But we only have a couple minutes. So what I wanted to do to kind of end the panel was, looking ahead, what would you each say, just very quickly, would be your hopes for the future of communicating science regarding like challenges and opportunities that we've all experienced, and putting the lessons that we've learned to use? Joe, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, look, I've been covering science and communicating it to the public, directly for more than a decade, which is about more than half of my journalism career. And, I have seen a growing interest among the public for this information, just a growing hunger for information about science, and an appetite not only for the top level findings, but understanding more deeply the science, how it's collected, how, an interest in more of the nuances, and a hunger for it. And, I've seen that growing in really all corners, and in places where I think a lot of people would be surprised. You wouldn't believe the number of people you might not think are super interested in science that really seem their antennas are up for this more than I've seen. And I guess my hope is that continues and continues to grow and continues to be there, because I think that curiosity is an engine for all the good things. And I have seen it increase, and I hope it continues.
That's awesome. Evan, what do you think?
First and foremost, it would be remiss for me not to say that I hope more people that look like me in a variety of ways are in science communication. Also, what gets me started to kind of tie it into the last question is the way that I communicate with people is also just being like a Black non-binary, like trans person who's like, I want to talk about ethics. And people are like, I've never seen that before. And I'm like, great. And I hope you join me. So it would be remiss to not say that looking like I do, and also keeping the humility of looking like I do, not shifting or assimilating, is also a huge one. But the other thing I would love to see is trusting communities to be more collaborative and knowing themselves and being part of the conversation in science, not being talked at or to, but with, as other experts. And then I also really hope that folks who work in the sciences see more of the value in the communication tools that are coming out. The weapons as well, weapons and tools, same thing, right? I can dig a garden with a hoe. I can also kill a man. So recognizing weapons and tools that are the same thing, but utilizing them. And yeah.
All right, we are almost, well, we are kind of out of time, but Heidi, we need to find out from you. What are your
Yeah.
there's
yeah, in the nutshell, there is a rising. I can feel it. There is a rising of energy, of voices, and of ideas in our world. And we've often been taught in Euro-Western cultures to claim those ideas as our own. And what Evan speaks to, the cooperation that our world needs, comes from being excited every time somebody says they want to do something similar to us, have a similar idea to us. Where and how can we see that that's how this works? If we feel like we're in a crisis and crises, right? There's many. How do we rise? We rise together through that momentum that comes from many, not singular. So that's where we need the America's Got Science. And yeah, I figure I'll give a plug for that and hope I get to talk with people tonight about America's Got Science. Someone's got to do that.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. I'd be on that show. Last thing I just want to say is I hope we continue to use the lessons that we've all learned and communicate them to all of our scientist friends and everyone we work with so that this type of thing becomes, I think, second nature in science training and science communication.
Thank you all. Nicole brought me back on stage so I could just say thank you to this panel. What a lovely conversation. Obviously, I've got my own curiosity sparked about things that you said. I agree. Hopefully our audience has questions as well for both how they view the world and things that you all said so that they can then go be curious themselves and inquire a little bit more deeply about this really rich conversation and all the different perspectives we had. Very grateful for all of you. Thank you so much for being here today for this really thoughtful conversation. Thank you for our audience for joining us. We're going to be back in 10 minutes with our closing keynote. So join us at 1/2 the hour, no matter what time zone you're in, where we're just going to take this conversation one step further. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.